All right, folks, welcome back to Study Hall, where we crack open some seriously dense stuff.
Mm.
We try to make sense of it all.
Mhm.
Today,
Yeah.
we're diving headfirst into something that could really shake up the landscape.
Oh, yeah.
The Accountable Capitalism Act.
This is a big one.
Have you heard about this thing?
I heard whispers.
It's basically proposing a whole new set of rules for how big corporations operate,
Like,
potentially even requiring them to get chartered by the feds.
whoa.
We're going straight to the source, folks. No spin.
Straight to the
This is
source.
the cold, hard text of the bill.
No opinions.
So grab your thinking caps,
Yeah.
because things are about to get interesting.
I'm ready.
I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so right off the bat,
Yeah.
the bill zeroes in on companies raking in over $1 billion in gross receipts.
Okay.
To me, that sounds like we're talking about those megacore,
Right.
the Apples,
Uh-huh.
Amazons,
Yeah.
Googles of the world.
The big...
But is that really the whole picture?
Well, it's actually a lot wider than just the tech giants.
Okay.
We're looking at a whole ecosystem of businesses here, from your classic corporations to LLCs, even some joint stock companies.
Really?
Think about the big players in every sector: Walmart,
Okay.
ExxonMobil, those huge pharmaceutical companies. They're all likely in the mix.
That pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, that really expands the scope. I mean, if a company selling allergy meds is caught up in this,
Right.
we're talking about a pretty massive shift in how business operates, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This act is casting a wide net, trying to set a new standard for a huge chunk of the economy,
Wow.
not just a select few at the top.
So to keep all these companies in check,
Mm-hmm.
they're proposing to create this whole new government agency,
Oh, boy.
the Office of United States Corporations.
Another one?
Honestly, when I first read that, I thought,
Yeah.
okay, more bureaucracy, great.
Right.
But what exactly would this office actually do?
It's more than just rubber stamping paperwork, that's for sure. This office would have the power to review and approve those new federal charters we talked about.
Yeah.
They'd be responsible for monitoring companies, making sure they're actually playing by the rules.
Okay.
And get this, they could even revoke a company's charter if they don't shape up.
Wait, hold on. Revoke their charter.
Yeah,
Like they could literally shut down a business if they don't follow the rules.
it's a possibility.
That seems like a pretty big hammer, right?
Yeah, it's not a power they'd wield lightly,
Okay.
but the act lays out some pretty clear circumstances for when that could happen.
Right.
Mainly if a company dips below that billion-dollar mark,
Okay.
or if they engage in some really serious misconduct.
So what we're talking about here is real accountability,
Real accountability.
not just fines
Nope.
or slaps on the wrist,
No way.
but potentially losing their entire right to operate.
The ultimate consequence.
But the thing that keeps tripping me up is this general public benefit phrase they keep using.
Yeah.
It sounds so vague. What does that even mean in practical terms?
Well, that's the beating heart of this whole thing.
Okay.
It's a fundamental shift from the old shareholders first mentality.
Right.
This act is saying that corporations need to think about the impact of their actions, not just on their profits,
I see.
but on their employees,
Uh-huh.
their customers,
Right.
the communities they operate in, and even the environment.
Wow.
It's about recognizing that corporations have a responsibility to the broader society,
Okay.
not just to their bottom line.
So it's not just about making money anymore.
It's bigger than that now.
They actually have to prove they're doing good in the world.
That's the idea.
Okay, so here's where things start to get really interesting.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
The bill gets specific about the makeup of corporate boards.
Interesting.
And I gotta say, this is a pretty radical idea.
Hit me with it.
They're proposing that employees should actually get to elect board members.
Whoa.
Did I read that right?
You read that right?
No way.
The act proposes that 2/5 of a corporation's board would be made up of people elected by the company's own employees.
So employees would actually have a say in how the company is run.
A real voice at the table.
Whoa. That's a pretty massive shakeup.
It's a big change.
I mean, imagine the impact that could have.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you could see it leading to better working conditions, fairer wages, employees having a real seat at the table.
Right.
But on the flip side, couldn't it also create some pretty hairy conflicts of interest?
Ooh, that's a good point.
What happens when what's good for employees clashes with what's good for the company's bottom line?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's a gamble for sure,
It is.
but a fascinating one.
Definitely keeps things interesting.
And speaking of big changes, the Act also takes aim at those cushy executive compensation packages.
Oh, yeah, those.
specifically putting some serious limits on how and when those high-flying execs can cash in their company stock.
Interesting.
What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it all comes back to aligning incentives. The Act includes two major restrictions.
Let's hear them.
First, execs wouldn't be able to sell any stock for 5 years after they get it.
5 years.
5 whole years.
Wow.
Second, they'd be barred from selling stock for 3 years after the company buys back its own shares, a tactic often used to artificially inflate stock prices.
So basically, they're trying to stop executives from just playing the stock market game
Yeah,
and cashing out after a quick bump.
that's the idea.
They want them thinking long term.
And thinking about the long game.
Exactly. It's about promoting a more sustainable,
Right.
more responsible approach to business.
Responsible growth.
Instead of chasing short-term profits, they want executives focused on creating real value for the company, its employees, and all those stakeholders we talked about earlier.
Creating value for everyone.
But doesn't that raise some questions too?
I'm sure it does.
I mean, could this make it harder for companies to attract top talent?
That's a good question.
Are the best and brightest going to want to work for a company with these restrictions? It's one thing to talk about corporate responsibility,
Sure.
but at the end of the day, these are businesses, right?
Businesses gotta do business.
It's clear this act isn't afraid to ask some tough questions and propose some really bold solutions.
Bold solutions for bold problems.
And speaking of bold, let's talk about this section on political spending. This is a juicy one.
This one caught my eye because it sets some pretty high bars for companies wanting to open their wallets for political causes.
Yeah.
What's the deal with that?
Transparency and accountability. That's the name of the game here.
Gotcha.
The act recognizes that corporate political spending can have a huge impact on elections and public policy.
All right.
So they're putting in place some pretty strict rules.
I like it.
If a company wants to engage in political spending, they need to get approval from a supermajority.
5.
That's 75%
75%.
of both their shareholders and their board of directors.
Wow.
That's a lot of people to get on board.
So no more backroom deals or a few execs deciding to bankroll their favorite candidate.
No. This requires everyone to be on board, right?
Yeah, everyone's got to be in agreement.
Exactly. It's about making sure that any political spending company does actually reflects the will of the majority of its stakeholders, not just the whims of a select few.
Power to the people.
So far, we've covered a lot of ground, from redefining corporate purpose to shaking up boardrooms and putting the brakes on executive pay.
It's a lot to unpack.
But we're just getting started, folks.
No, there's more.
Stick with us as we continue to dissect this Accountable Capitalism Act
Okay.
and explore what it could mean for the future of business and for all of us.
I'm buckled up and ready to go.
I am too. This is getting good.
About to get real.
All right.
Let's do it.
You know, diving into this act really makes you think, what's the role of these massive corporations in a society like ours?
Yeah.
They have so much power, so much influence.
It's crazy.
It's almost like they're these giant entities
Right.
operating in their own world
They're their own little world.
with their own rules.
Rules for thee, but not for me.
That's a powerful image, and it gets at the heart of the debate surrounding this act.
Right at the heart of it.
Are these corporations just economic machines driven solely by profit?
That's the question.
Or are they something more?
Is there more to it?
Do they have a social responsibility that extends beyond just making money for shareholders?
It's a good question.
Right? It's like this act is saying, hey, hold on. Maybe these companies need to be held to a different standard.
Interesting.
But who decides what that standard should be?
That's the tricky part.
And who has the power to enforce it?
Even trickier.
I mean, we talked about this Office of United States Corporations.
Right.
And just the scope of what they'd be tasked with is mind-boggling.
It's a lot.
How could they possibly oversee thousands of corporations and make sure they're all following the rules?
That's the big question.
That's a Herculean task, no doubt.
It really is.
Imagine the resources and infrastructure they'd need
Oh, yeah.
to effectively monitor all these companies, investigate complaints, conduct audits,
Tons of paperwork.
and potentially even take enforcement action.
It's a whole new level of bureaucracy.
It raises all sorts of questions about bureaucracy, efficiency, and the potential for government overreach.
Government overreach is a valid concern.
That's a concern I have, too. I mean, I get it. We need accountability.
Accountability is important.
But is this the right way to do it?
What do you think?
Is this too much government intervention in the private sector?
Interesting question.
Or are we finally striking a balance, holding these corporations accountable for the impact they have on our lives?
Finding that balance is key.
It's a tough call.
It is a tough call.
It's a question that goes to the core of how we view capitalism itself.
The heart of the matter.
Is it a system that ultimately benefits everyone?
Does it?
Or does it primarily serve the interests of the wealthy and powerful?
The age-old debate.
This act is forcing us to confront those fundamental questions.
It's time to face the music.
And it's pushing for some pretty radical changes in how things are done.
Radical changes indeed.
Like we talk about, those limits on executive compensation.
Oh, yeah.
That's a big deal.
It's a big deal for those execs.
But how does that fit into this bigger picture of corporate responsibility?
How does it fit in?
Is it really about changing how these executives think, or is it just a symbolic gesture?
I think it's more than just symbolic.
Really?
Yeah, those restrictions on stock sales are directly tied to this idea of aligning incentives.
Okay, how so?
By making it harder for executives to cash in on short-term stock fluctuations, the act is trying to incentivize them to focus on long-term value creation, not just quick profits.
I see. So it's like a long-term investment strategy.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, I see that it's like they're saying, hey, if you're going to make decisions that affect the lives of thousands of employees, millions of customers, and maybe even the environment, you better be in it for the long haul. You better be thinking about the bigger picture.
It's about seeing the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's about promoting a more responsible, more ethical approach to corporate leadership.
Ethical leadership is key.
The idea is to shift the focus away from just maximizing shareholder returns
Okay.
and towards creating sustainable value for all stakeholders.
Sustainable value for all.
But couldn't that also backfire?
It's a possibility.
I mean, some folks argue that these restrictions could actually make it harder for companies to attract and retain top talent.
Yeah, I've heard that argument.
If you're a high-flying CEO, are you going to want to work for a company that limits your ability to cash in on your stock options?
It's a tough sell.
It's a legitimate concern.
It is.
Some critics argue that these provisions could lead to a brain drain, with the best executives opting for companies with less restrictive compensation structures.
I can see that happening.
Others counter that true leaders should be motivated by more than just financial gain,
There's more to life than money.
that the opportunity to make a positive impact should be a powerful draw.
Making a difference. That's what matters.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Very complex indeed.
It's a balancing act, for sure.
Finding that balance is the key.
And it's not just about the executives, right?
No, it's not.
This act also addresses the power of corporations to influence politics.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And it doesn't shy away from setting some pretty strong guidelines for how they can engage in political spending.
They're laying down the law.
Why is that such a key part of this conversation about corporate responsibility?
Because political influence is a huge part of corporate power.
Okay, I see that.
It's about transparency and accountability in a realm where those things are often lacking.
Transparency is key.
The Act recognizes that corporate political spending can have a massive impact on elections and public policy.
Oh, absolutely.
So they're putting in place some safeguards to ensure that such spending aligns with the interests of a broad range of stakeholders, not just a select few.
That makes sense.
That 75% approval requirement for both shareholders and the board, that's a pretty high bar to clear.
75%, that's a supermajority.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
It's like they're saying, okay, corporations, we get that you want to be involved in the political process, but you can't just throw your money around without any oversight.
Nope.
If you want to use your financial clout to influence elections, you need to have a clear mandate from your employees, your shareholders, and your board.
It's about getting everyone on board.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about democratizing the process and ensuring that corporate political spending reflects a broader consensus rather than just the preferences of a few powerful individuals.
Power to the people.
But isn't that also kind of tricky?
It can be.
Where do you draw the line between corporate influence and legitimate political participation?
That's the question.
Some folks argue that this act infringes on the First Amendment rights of corporations.
The First Amendment argument, that's a big one.
That's a very real concern that's been raised by opponents of the act.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
They argue that corporations as legal entities should have the same free speech rights as individuals.
Corporations are people too, they say.
Supporters of the act counter that corporations are not individuals in the traditional sense,
Not so fast, they say.
and that their immense financial power gives them an outsized influence in the political arena.
Money talks.
It's a classic debate about where the limits of corporate power lie and how to balance those limits with fundamental rights.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one for sure.
For sure.
And this act throws gasoline on that fire.
Oh, yeah, it's going to get heated.
It's really forcing us to rethink some fundamental assumptions about the role of corporations in our society.
Time to rethink the status quo.
It goes to the very heart of the social contract between business and the public.
The heart of the matter.
It challenges us to ask, what do we expect from these powerful entities? What responsibilities do they have, not just to their shareholders, but to their employees, their customers, and to the communities they operate in?
Big questions, big responsibilities.
It's a conversation that's long overdue.
Way overdue.
And this act, whether it passes or not, has already sparked a wave of debate and discussion about these critical issues.
It's getting people talking, that's for sure.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've explored the goals of this act, the potential benefits, and some of the concerns.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But the big question is, how realistic is it that this bill would actually become law?
Yeah, that's the real question.
I mean, it's one thing to have an idea.
Ideas are easy.
But it's another thing to actually get it passed and implemented.
Implementation, that's the hard part.
That's a tough one to predict.
It is a tough one.
This act faces some serious opposition from powerful business groups and many lawmakers who argue that it's too radical departure from the current system.
They're not going to give up without a fight.
They see it as government overreach and a threat to the free market.
The free market is sacred to them.
On the other hand, it has strong support from progressive groups and lawmakers who believe that corporations need to be held more accountable for their actions.
The other side is fired up too.
They see it as a necessary step to address growing inequality and corporate abuse.
Inequality and abuse are real problems.
So it's a battle between two very different visions of capitalism.
Two very different visions.
Is it a system that can be reformed and made more equitable? Or is this level of intervention just too much?
A fundamental question.
That's the million-dollar question.
And one that doesn't have an easy answer.
Ultimately, the fate of this act likely hinges on the political climate, the level of public support it can garner, and the willingness of lawmakers to challenge the status quo.
It's all about politics.
It's a David and Goliath situation, for sure.
David and Goliath, indeed.
But even if it doesn't become law in its current form, it's already forcing us to ask some really important questions about the relationship between business and society.
It's starting a conversation.
And those are questions that deserve to be debated and discussed.
We need to talk about this.
We can't just sweep them under the rug.
No more sweeping things under the rug.
The future of our economy and our democracy may very well depend on how we answer them.
The stakes are high.
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier.
What's that?
The nuclear option built into this act.
The nuclear option.
That ability for state attorneys general to petition for a corporation's charter to be revoked.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's definitely a provision that raises some eyebrows.
Sure.
I mean, we're talking about potentially shutting down an entire company.
It's a big deal.
What kind of actions would actually trigger something like that? It seems like a pretty extreme measure.
It is, and it's intended to be a last resort. The Act lays out a pretty high bar for what would constitute grounds for charter revocation.
Okay.
We're not talking about minor infractions or simple negligence.
Right.
It's about repeated, egregious, and illegal activities that cause significant harm to a corporation's stakeholders or the communities they operate in.
So give me some examples. What kind of corporate bad behavior would actually cross that line?
Think widespread consumer fraud on a massive scale.
Okay.
Intentional and blatant environmental damage.
Gotcha.
Or systematic and severe violations of labor laws that result in real harm to workers. These are actions that demonstrate a complete disregard for the law and the well-being of others, a fundamental breach of the social contract that we were just talking about.
So it's not just about making a few bad business decisions or cutting some corners.
It's more serious than that.
It's about holding corporations accountable for actions that actually hurt people, potentially, on a large scale.
Actions have consequences.
It's like saying, look, if you're going to operate in our society, you have a responsibility to play by the rules and to treat people fairly. And if you repeatedly violate those basic principles, you could lose your right to exist as a corporation.
You lose your privileges when you abuse them.
Exactly. It's about creating real consequences for corporate malfeasance that go beyond just fines or settlements.
Fines haven't always been enough.
Those traditional methods of enforcement haven't always been effective in deterring bad behavior.
They haven't been a strong enough deterrent.
This provision is saying that if a corporation repeatedly abuses its power and harms others, it can lose its privileged status. It's a powerful message.
It sends a clear message.
It definitely sends a strong signal, But I'm also curious about the process itself.
Okay, the process.
I mean, how would this charter revocation actually work? Who gets to decide, and is there any room for appeal? I imagine a company facing something like this would fight tooth and nail to stay in business.
Of course they would. It's their livelihood.
So walk me through it.
Okay, so it's a multi-step process designed to ensure fairness and due process.
Right, fairness and due process.
First, a state's attorney general would have to file a petition with the Office of United States Corporation,
Okay.
laying out the case for why a company's charter should be revoked.
So they have to make a strong case.
A very strong case.
And then what happens?
The corporation would then have an opportunity to respond to the allegations and present its own defense.
So it's not just a unilateral decision by the government.
No, it's not.
The company gets a chance to make its case.
Absolutely, it's not a kangaroo court.
I like that.
The director of the Office of United States Corporations would then review the evidence and arguments from both sides.
Okay, so they act as a judge.
Like a judge.
And then what?
And then they make a recommendation to the Secretary of Commerce, who has the final authority to approve or reject the petition.
Okay, so there are checks and balances built into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens if a company disagrees with the decision? Can they appeal?
Yes. The decision can be challenged in federal court. So there are legal avenues for corporations to fight back if they believe they've been wrongly targeted. It's not an absolute power that the government wields. It's subject to judicial review.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the ins and outs of this Accountable Capitalism Act, from redefining corporate purpose and empowering stakeholders to potentially revoking charters. This bill is definitely pushing the boundaries of what we think about when we talk about the role of corporations in society.
It's a game changer.
It's a conversation starter, that's for sure.
Definitely a conversation starter.
It challenges some fundamental assumptions about the nature of capitalism and the relationship between business and the public good.
Time for a reality check.
It's forcing us to ask tough questions about power, responsibility, and accountability.
Questions we need to be asking.
It's making us think, isn't it?
It is.
And that's what we're all about here at Study Hall.
Oh.
We want to spark those critical thinking neurons, get those synapses firing. We've laid out the facts, explored the arguments, and hopefully given you the tools to form your own informed opinions about this complex and controversial issue.
Hopefully we've given you some food for thought.
At the end of the day, it's up to each of us to decide where we stand on this. Do we believe that corporations need to be held to a higher standard? Do we think this act is the right way to achieve that? Or is it a step too far? These are questions that each of us has to grapple with.
We all have to decide what we believe.
And that's where we leave it for today, folks. Remember, this is just a deep dive, a starting point for your own exploration. We encourage you to seek out the full text of the bill, read up on different perspectives, and engage in those tough conversations with your friends, family, and colleagues.
Keep learning, keep questioning.
Stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and never stop learning.
That's the key.
That's the study hallway. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Let's buzz.